Yeah, order. You are an incorrigible delinquent at times. Behave yourself, man.
Let's meet our guest this week. Emily Dyer is a researcher and journalist who writes for the Daily Beast and the New Statesman. Ian Dale is a radio presenter and political commentator. Owen Jones is a writer and columnist for The Guardian. And Bishop Stephen Cotterill is the Bishop of Chelmsford. Welcome to you all, and thank you very much for being with us this morning. Deaths in Paris and Mali. Fear in Belgium about an imminent attack. Countries around the world are on heightened alert and questioning how best to defeat ISIS. France, Russia and the United States are bombing strongholds in Syria. Britain is part of the airstrike campaign over the border in Iraq, but Prime Minister David Cameron is keen to extend that to Syria and get Britain involved. Now, he lost a vote on airstrikes in Syria 2 years ago, but then the target was President Assad. Now, it'll be ISIS. Well, the UN, in its new resolution, says countries can use all means to try to combat this unprecedented threat. So, should we stand shoulder to shoulder with our allies to defeat them militarily, or would that kill innocent civilians and make us more of a target? Our first question this morning, should Britain join airstrikes in Syria? Also joining our panel from our Blackburn studio this morning, Anjem Anwar, who's an interfaith campaigner and Church of England worker. Good morning to you. Thank you very much for being with us. I want, though, to start with you, Owen. We've just heard the Chancellor, George Osborne, on the Andrew Marr programme saying that Britain is not a country that sits on the sidelines. Do we have to accept we are at war, and if so, that we need airstrikes?
Well, I was in Paris last week outside the Bataclan Theatre. Impossible not to be moved and repulsed. This is a murderous death cult which committed an atrocity. It attracts these pathetic, murdering losers. And I say that because they depend on their reputation. They like the idea of the French president declaring that they are at war with them. It gives them, I think, a legitimacy which they do not deserve. The danger, I suppose, with what we face now is we've had 14 years of the so-called war on terror. Can anyone with a straight face say it's been a success since those atrocities on 9/11? We've had wars, bombings, invasions, and the net result is these groups are more extreme and more powerful than ever. Al-Qaeda is actually on the verge of defeat, but not at the hands of the West, at the hands of ISIS, a group even more extreme and murderous themselves.
No, you can't defeat them, and you wouldn't defeat them militarily.
Well, for me, it's a question. There's this quote sometimes people say, Albert Einstein said it, which is the definition of insanity is doing the same thing over and over again and expecting a different result. I'd like to see issues dealt with like the Turkish government allowing ISIS to go across the border and attacking their Kurdish, the people taking them on, the Kurdish freedom fighters. Also Saudi Arabia exporting international extremism.
Right.
We're not dealing with those issues.
OK, and we'll look at those in a sec. But Ian, let's talk about airstrikes first. Are you in favour?
I am, but not just airstrikes. I think that, I actually share a few of Owen's views, though, you might be surprised to hear. I think that airstrikes have got to be one part of a campaign against, and I call them Daesh, not ISIS, because they don't like it, so let's call them something they don't like. Pathetic gesture, but hey. I think that we have to recognise that this has become a war, but Owen's right, we can't repeat the mistakes that we made in Iraq and Afghanistan. So we've got to have a view to the long term. What happens if we manage to beat Daesh, that we obliterate them in some way? Now, you can obliterate them militarily, we can bomb them, we can put ground troops in and all the rest of it. But you can't actually obliterate an ideology. There will still be people there, even in the aftermath, who hold this ideology. So there's got to be, at least in the end, a sort of hearts and minds campaign. Now, the government in this country, under the Prevent programme, have tried to sort of implement that here for British Muslims, and it hasn't been a massive success. And I think part of the big problem that we have is to sort of sell this to this sort of community that we call the British Muslim community. I'm not sure it is a homogenous community. And say to people, and I think that there are receptive ears there.
But this is part of what you're saying is airstrikes should be part of a much broader strategy that takes in diplomacy.
And Owen's absolutely right about Saudi Arabia, and this is an uncomfortable message for the British government. But we have got to stop Saudi funding of ISIS, Daesh. We've got to stop Saudi funding of some British mosques, because they are the root of extremism in this country. That's part of it too. So airstrikes do not solve this on their own.
Bishop Stephen Cotterill, what do you think? I was interested in Defence Secretary Michael Fallon, who said it would be morally indefensible for us to rely on other countries to tackle ISIS. Do you think there is a moral responsibility?
I mean, as a faith leader, I think most faith leaders are very, very reluctant ever to decide that dropping bombs on people is a good idea. I recognise there's a logical inconsistency about saying you can bomb them this side of the line but not the other. I recognise that.
So in Iraq but not in Syria, as is...
But I think what I would want to say is that if the military intervention is simply to crush ISIS, then it will fail. The strategy, therefore, needs to be not how do we defeat ISIS, but how do we defeat what comes after ISIS? Because, as has been said, we have just about, or Al-Qaeda has just about been defeated, but something else has been spawned. Now, we have to take responsibility for that.
But is it airstrikes that we need to do first?
Well,
forgive me, but do we need that as a first option?
I concede that military intervention will be part of a plan, but I cannot support military airstrikes until I see the plan. And that's what I don't see at the moment.
But you would, once you see a plan, you would... that must be really difficult for a man of faith and a man of the cloth to agree to airstrikes, which will kill people.
Well, I am not a pacifist, but I do support what is known as the just war theory. And the just war theory, which is a theory which makes sense in the realpolitik of these situations, does concede that in certain circumstances it is appropriate to use force. But until I see the plan and actually see what are we going to do to make sure this isn't just crushing an enemy which will then spawn another enemy, I don't support the airstrikes. I don't support military intervention, but I'd want to make it clear it's not that military intervention can never happen, but it can't just happen in order to crush and defeat something which will actually not solve the problem.
OK, thank you. Emily, should it be part of the plan?
I think extending airstrikes absolutely has to be part of a wider plan. I absolutely agree with Ian. It's absurd that we are recognising a border that effectively no longer exists between Iraq and Syria. But we also have to acknowledge that while airstrikes will weaken and degrade ISIS, it will succeed in doing that. It will not destroy ISIS and it will not resolve the conflict in Syria. There are several things that need to happen in order for the conflict to be resolved that cannot be done solely through airstrikes. One of those is destroying ISIS. ISIS have been very clever. They've dispersed throughout major cities. Therefore, it's impossible to destroy them without causing major civilian casualties if we were purely to rely on airstrikes. The second thing that needs to happen is that we need to establish safe zones. That, again, can't just happen with airstrikes. We would need people on the ground supporting the Syrian people in doing that.
So boots on the ground, troops on the ground?
Well, I don't see any other way around it. If you want to establish a safe zone where the Syrian people who live there at the moment can take their families, but also those who have gone abroad can return safely with their families, we would need to establish a safe zone. We need to address the elephant in the room, which is the fact that as long as Assad is in power, this conflict will not be resolved. Assad started the conflict. He's been the fuel behind the conflict. He's the fuel, in many ways, behind ISIS. And until he steps down, this conflict will not end.
But doesn't that raise the question of what are airstrikes doing? Who are they targeting? Are you targeting Assad and Assad fighters? Are you targeting ISIS? Are you targeting all the above?
Well, the proposal on the table at the moment is to target ISIS. So what we would do is we need a targeted approach. We would target senior commanders. We should target oil in transit, which is, as we know, one of the main fundraising forces behind the group. We would target open battalions. We would target infrastructure. We have to make sure that this approach is effective. There have been too many reports of strikes on empty buildings that aren't making any difference.
With you in a sec, I just want to bring in Anjum Anwar. You've heard what our panellists have been saying here. Airstrikes should, say some, be part of a coordinated plan. What are your views?
Well, I like to see some evidence where bombings have actually reduced tensions. I don't see that evidence. And how many countries are we going to actually bomb? If you look at the evidence, Boko Haram, who have recently bombed Kano and Yola, you know, are we going to bomb Nigeria? Is that what the next step would be? I just find it quite appalling to think that we can even actually think blanket bombing will resolve the problem.
Nobody's
ISIS
talking
or
about blanket
Daesh is a symptom, and we need to find out what are the causes, what are the issues, what are the problems, and I think that has to be done round the table and not by dropping bombs.
So not by, but the UK has a duty to respond, to give aid and assistance to another EU member under threat. That has been agreed by foreign ministers at the European Union. It's part of the Lisbon Treaty. What should Britain do? Can you negotiate with these people? I mean, when they're beheading and using Kalashnikovs to murder innocent people in the streets?
Well, from my understanding, and novice understanding that is, we had 47 bombings from the IRA on our mainland. Eventually, we didn't go around just blanket bombing Ireland. We talked with them. We sat around the table. It's very difficult, but we have to sit with people
and we have to
speak.
Are you seriously comparing the IRA with ISIS? I mean, you must live on a different planet. The problem with this approach is if you don't believe in any kind of military action, then you have to say what else you would do. You can't negotiate with a death cult. Do you not understand that?
Let Anjem answer.
What I'm saying to you is that we negotiated, our governments negotiated, and you know, we are good at that. And I think we need to sit with people and we need to find out why this is happening. As I said earlier, these are symptoms.
Who would you sit down with?
Well, I'm afraid I'm not going to be able to respond to that. You're in power. You're going to have to find the people who you're going to be bombing and find the leadership wherever they are and talk to them.
Anjem, thank you.
If you can find those people to bomb, you can find them to talk to them.
Thank you.
Well, let's just see where we agree and disagree on all this, because firstly, obviously, there's no prospect ever of negotiating with this murderous death cult. They don't want to negotiate. They have an apocalyptic vision of the world which they wish to satisfy. There's no basis for negotiating with them. But in terms of where we, I suppose, agree, and I'd like to come on to what you said, is actually the role of Assad, because unsurprisingly, our attention is focusing on ISIS because they have targeted our own, if you like. But the vast majority of people killed in Syria are not being killed by ISIS. They're being killed by Assad. A single barrel bomb dropped by Assad can kill as many people in one go as was killed in Paris last week. And the reality is, amongst the Sunni population, who of course constitute the majority in Syria, there is no love for ISIS, but often they fear Assad far more than they fear ISIS.
But what would you do about that?
What we need is this is why we need a political solution which brings in all the key players except for ISIS, across the region and locally.
And that's happening in Vienna.
Exactly, and that's got to be a focus, to come up with a national unity government that can command the support of the Sunni population.
But meantime, Owen, the threat is imminent.
Yes, but there are things to welcome at the moment, and it's important to see those, and it is welcome that nations are now, it seems, just this week, better prepared to sit down and talk to each other about finding a solution, constructing a plan, and that is a step forward.
But just the same question to you, really, which is, with an imminent threat and with apparently police in the UK foiling 7 terror attacks at least, you know, what does something not need to be done now? Well, yes, while people negotiate.
Well, the point there is, obviously what happened in terms of in France, this was largely French and Belgian people who were responsible for it. It was a domestic, largely. Obviously, it had a connection with Syria, but when you have people who are radicalised in your own countries, that's separate from what's going on in Syria. But on that, the point I'd just make again, because it always comes down to we have to do something. You know, if there was a burning flame in the studio, and I picked up a can of petrol and poured it on, and you said, what on earth are you doing? And I said, we have to do something. I can't think myself, and correct me if I'm wrong, of a single Western intervention in the Arab world that has had successful results. And what I would ask people who support intervention is...
But you'll get a glass of water and put it out, Owen, that's the point.
This is where it breaks down, because there's a simple solution to that, there isn't in this case.
That's an argument for never, ever doing anything. And I think the positive thing, as Stephen says, is that this week we've had the EU come out with a joint policy. You've had the United Nations Security Council voting unanimously on this resolution. Now, none of us would have expected that to happen. There has got to be a broad international coalition. But where I think the British government's getting it wrong is they're doing it the wrong way round. They want to deal with Assad before they deal with ISIS. Now, I think, and this may be unpalatable, but I think you have to park Assad for the moment and deal with him
deal
afterwards.
with ISIS. Can I put Owen's point to you, Emily, which is that something must be done, and there is always a risk of trying to do something in the heat of the moment. I mean, this is what Jeremy Corbyn says. It's vital not to be drawn into responses that feed a cycle of violence. We've been there before. We've seen the consequences of getting involved in a war in terror. Should we be doing the same again?
Whether or not you agree with previous foreign policy, we have a moral responsibility to intervene in Syria. The Syrian people asked us to help 4 years ago, and we sat back and let Assad kill just under 250,000 of the Syrian people. Hundreds of thousands of Syrian people. We have failed to stop our own citizens from travelling abroad to what is effectively a training camp. ISIS territory is a training camp, and those people that were involved in the Paris plots were trained in Syria. Syria plays an absolutely integral part in making you a lethal terrorist that poses a threat to Europe. If we do not degrade ISIS and destroy ISIS, we will continue to see not only the oppression and brutalisation of the Syrian people, we will continue to see the ISIS borders expanding, but we will also continue to see, and I hate to say it, but we will continue to see future Paris-like attacks happening in Europe. We have to accept that the Syrian conflict is not just a Middle Eastern problem, it's a European problem and it's a global problem.
That's why these French bombing raids the day after the terror attacks were actually important, because they targeted the training camps. So they're not targeting civilians. If you look at the number of civilian deaths from American and French airstrikes, they are very, very small. A lot of the American air raids, they actually turn back without dropping the bombs if they think they're going to hit a civilian target, unlike the Russians, who, I'm afraid, couldn't give a damn about that.
There was a journalist group called Air Wars which said in August that in 52 airstrikes there were nearly 500 non-combatants killed, including 100 children. And if you have airstrikes, there's no doubt that
nobody's going to deny.
Going to be killed.
Absolutely, in a war situation, these things will happen, and we can't get away from that.
There are forces fighting on the ground, the Kurdish forces, who at the moment are being attacked and persecuted and arrested by the Turkish government, one of our key allies. That has to be addressed. I'd like to see the arming, the systematic arming of the Kurdish militia. We do need to get, if we're going to talk about the source of these problems, it's the fact that Saudi Arabia exports extremist Wahhabi forms of fundamentalist extremism, not just in Syria, but all over the world. That's a threat to our national security, but unfortunately our government is complicit in it.
Bishop Stephen Cotterill, in Songs of Praise, which is going out tonight, the Archbishop of Canterbury, who's done a pre-recorded interview, will say, two injustices don't make justice. If we start randomly killing those who've not done wrong, that's not going to provide solutions. Governments have to be the means of justice. And I know you agree, because you've already been talking about the need for governments to come up with a coordinated plan, something more than airstrikes, but two injustices...
Nice if the Archbishop did, wouldn't it? I mean, those are fine words, but they don't actually offer any kind of solution at all.
Yeah, and I think it's actually a gross misunderstanding.
Well, can I ask the Bishop to respond to that?
What I'm saying is that I do see military intervention as part of a solution, but at the moment, if the military intervention is only to crush and degrade, I suspect what will happen here is what's happened in the past, that something else, we will successfully crush ISIS, but something else will emerge equally horrific pretty quickly.
So what would you use it for, the airstrikes?
Well, the airstrike, what I would like to see is much greater attention given to what might happen next. That isn't what happened in Iraq. If we make the same mistake again, history will repeat itself.
So bomb first, but with an exit strategy.
Well, no, that you have to do both together.
Okay.
Clearly, there needs to be some kind of defence exercise.
Think back to 1944, which none of us can remember. But
surely you can.
No, thank you. But in 1944, we were bombing Germany. And at the same time, we were planning for the post-war settlement and what we would do with Germany after the war. The Marshall Plan was being thought about, and then after the war, it was implemented. That's the kind of thinking we've got to do in Syria, which we didn't do in Iraq.
Let's find out what you've been saying at home. Tommy, lots of people getting in touch with us.
Huge amounts, and lots of people questioning the appropriateness and the accuracy of airstrikes. Grace, for example, saying 90% of drone casualties are unintended, i.e. they're killing loads of civilians. I'm certain that it would be easier and better, to use highly trained troops. Andrew in Manchester says, if we join the airstrikes or not, we are still a target. Therefore, we should support our allies. Robert makes a point about the Syrian government, which I think Emily and Owen were saying today. It says, no, something you need to understand about Syria is that the Syrian government treats Syrian people even worse than IS does. David saying airstrikes will be no good. Unfortunately, ISIS have shown that they can get into any country. Just because America wants to, we don't have to. Let's stand on our own 2 feet for once. And Mr. Hartley also supporting that comment by saying the UK should let the USA get on with any of the bombings of ISIS. The USA dragged us into this stupid war a century. Let the USA get on with it. Sham.
Thank you very
Drag
much.
us into 2 wars. I think that needs to be challenged. The US did not drag us into the First or Second World War. They might have dragged us into Iraq or whatever, but America freed us in the First and Second World War.
Thank you, thank you. Interesting as well that President Obama says that America would lead a global movement against extremists today. So that's, if you're interested, that's how America is looking at this at the moment. You picked up a point, Owen, which one of our texters said, which is about if you bomb in Syria, which is where they're being trained, you've also got to recognise that there are many cells in lots of different countries, in Africa, in Belgium, as we know. Is it a case that you can't put out all these fires?
Well, there needs to be clearly a global comprehensive solution to that because, look, in the 1980s, when unfortunately the West supported the Islamic fundamentalist Mujahideen, particularly US funding which went through the Pakistani secret services and helped these extremist groups, is what happened after the war. Kind of, you know, the Soviets were driven out, they dispersed across the world. And that's the danger as well we have to face with Syria. The other point which is picked up in that comment about the government, the real point is if we get a Syrian national unity government decided by all regional players that can get the support of the Sunni population, then we can have a situation where they can militarily take on ISIS instead of having the Assad regime doing it, which is barrel bombing and attacking people. Well, it's the only solution. Everybody agrees on that. Everybody knows there has to be this national unity government, and then they can conduct military operations without attacking their own people.
Many thanks to all of you.
I've been getting away with it all